Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Fall in Vermont is best known for spectacular foliage, but adding to the colorful landscape are Vermont pumpkins and apples. By all accounts, it's been a decent pumpkin growing season, but what about the apples? To find out, Across the Fence's Rebecca Gollin went to the UVM Hort Farm and spoke with the farm director and apple expert, Terry Bradshaw.
We seem to be in a pattern in Vermont where in odd numbered years, and this has really been going on since about 2009 or 11, we've been in a high apple year, high crop. So we're having a pretty flush year. I would say it's about 110% of a normal year. We'll probably produce about 1 million bushels in the state, maybe just shy of that. Average has been about 875,000 bushels per year statewide. And we're doing pretty well on that. It's been an interesting year. I say it's been an average year because it was very cold and wet at the beginning of the season and it's very hot and dry at the end of the season. So if you average those out, it's been an average year, but it's been also a stressful year because of the cold and wet and the hot and dry. So it's been a little bit tricky on the trees. Orchards that are managed and managed well and pruned and diseases managed and fertilized are doing well. They're holding the fruit on the trees, but we're seeing a lot of issues with wild trees or backyard trees that aren't tended to year after year with a lot of disease and a lot of defoliation. So just because your tree in your backyard looks like it doesn't have any fruit or maybe even any leaves at this time of year doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of fruit in orchards.
So you made some changes here on the farm. Tell us about those.
In the apple side of things, we've been doing some fairly aggressive replanting of orchards, pulling out some older research trials, not because the trees weren't producing anymore, but we are a research facility primarily, at least in the apple side of things. So as older trials come out, we're putting in some new ones. We're putting in some fairly high density, kind of modern style orchards where the trees are planted very close together with some of the more new varieties. We're in the grape world. We have been replanting a new variety trial. We had a 10-year-long variety trial that we just completed the research on and published that data. And it's time to start looking at what new is coming out. So there's a lot of new wine grape varieties that I hope we're at the cusp of learning about them as the growers are planting them as well, but they like us to make the mistakes before them. And then I'd say the biggest change in the last really 3 to 4, maybe 5 years has been a pretty major expansion of our vegetable production, mostly around teaching. There's a little bit of research involved in there with multiple different researchers from around campus, but most of that is used for undergraduate and non-credit teaching programs, which have grown quite a bit. We've gotten to the point where we have in the summer about 30 students, in the fall about 20 full-time. I mean, every day the classroom's packed, the fields, there's a buzz of activity. So we've really seen a big jump in that. And we've seen a lot of interest campus-wide in that. We have a CSA share program, so we have a lot of community members, UVM community members who purchase food from the farm. We're closing the loop with Sodexo Food Service and selling them some produce on campus. So we're getting our produce in the dining halls. And I've been at the Hort Farm for 23 years. And until very recently, we have not been growing the food that we grow, which is a lot of food, very close to campus, and providing it back to campus. So that's been a really big jump. And we needed to have the critical mass of the students and the new teaching programs to expand the production to do that. So that's been another really big change.
We've talked about it a little bit, but what are some of the current research projects going on here?
Yes, so we've got, I would say, in the fruit side of things, in my research program, 3 main areas that we're working on. So we have the change in the wine grape evaluation trial, where we're adapting to, or we've replanted to new varieties. And we're really looking forward to that. We're at the very beginning. The vines are 2 years old, so there was a few clusters of fruit here and there. But next year we'll start to get a crop and we'll start to be able to collect some fruit quality data on that. And I'm really excited about that because the wine grape industry has been growing slowly, but I mean, it grew fast early on, and now it's kind of, it's plateaued, and it's, the players that are here are doing well. But there are some issues, especially with the certain qualities of the fruit, particularly high acidity, is a really tricky thing because the cold hardy variety or the cold hardy species that's bred with vinifera or the classic wine grape to make these things cold hardy brings a very high acid grape. In the apple production, We are, for research, we are moving, I'd say, in two different areas. One is I've been doing since 2014 some different cider apple production research, and which is backwards to what we used to do. So for the first 100 years that the UVM apple program was here, we did everything we could to teach growers how not to grow a cider apple. We helped them grow the finest, high quality dessert fruit, what we call dessert fruit, but something that you eat out of hand, and try to minimize the number of fruit that don't meet that grade. And now with the expansion of the cider industry, there's a lot more interest in producing cider apples. There's really two different types of cider apples. There's the second grade dessert fruit, so McIntosh, Cortland, Empire, that don't meet that high standard. There are cider companies that will buy those by the tractor trailer load, but the economics and the pricing are not really there for growers to just say, I'm just going to grow all my apples and send them off to cider. We're not there. In the last couple of years, that's what a lot of, if not even most of the work has been done, is to figure out some of that economics on there. The flip side is there's another whole class of apple varieties that are bred and grown specifically for making fermented cider. They taste terrible off the tree. A lot of them taste very tannic, like you're chewing a tea bag. They have a weird sensation in the mouth, kind of prickly and drying. So you're never going to sell these on the fresh market. You're never going to get the premium prices selling them on the fresh market. But because they're in such short supply and they make high quality cider, sometimes when blended with traditional dessert varieties, they do command a fairly high price, not as high as dessert fruit, but a relatively high price to where growers are planting them and growing them just as cider fruit, which opens up a whole new world of potential research. First of all, which varieties grow well in Vermont? Most of these are from England, France, more maritime climates, milder climates than here. So that's one part. The other part is what types of systems do they work in well? Do they grow, traditionally in Europe, these are grown on fairly large trees, sometimes really large trees where sheep actually graze underneath the trees, which for food safety reasons really can't be done in the US. Meanwhile, in dessert fruit, we're moving toward these skinny little trees on wires. And the question is, how do these apples fit into either of those systems? And how can we establish these systems at a cost that growers can afford to grow them? Because when you grow trees very close together, 1,000 trees per acre on lots of wires and trellis and lots of infrastructure, it's very high cost, high opportunity cost, but also high reward if you do it right, based upon the prices you get for dessert fruit. We don't know that cider apples, traditional specialty cider apples, have the same economic model. They may not yield as much. They probably won't yield as much. They're often biennial, we call that. So they have a high production year and a low production year. Sometimes that can be almost on and off like a light switch. So we're looking at some strategies to try to reduce that biennialism and also plant out orchards basically by retraining the trees into a different shape so you can plant fewer trees per acre and get the benefit of these high density kind of planar walled orchard systems without spending $25,000 or $30,000 per acre to plant them. The third area that we're working in is a continuation of some of the research that we did for almost a decade, which was our organic apple production research. And right now we are working on a rootstock trial, organic rootstock trial. So this tree I'm standing in front of here is a Modi, is the fruit. It's an Italian apple. It's a scab-resistant variety, so it's very well suited to organic production. And again, we're not sure under organic conditions whether or not these really high-density systems are really the best way to go. The systems, they're not as robust as non-organic systems. Some of the trees, and we learned this from our past experience, the trees may not be vigorous enough to establish under these systems. So this is a trial of about 15 rootstocks, mostly from the Cornell breeding program, to try to evaluate and see which ones of these rootstocks will grow best in this system and give high quality fruit.
So what's going on these days with the apple industry in Vermont?
If you were to consider New England a state, it would be as big of a player as Michigan or New York. So where do we fit into New England and where do we fit nationwide? Vermont's interesting in that many of our orchards, we really have what I learned, it's called a bifurcated model. So you've got a handful, a small number of large producers that grow the majority of the fruit, and then a lot of smaller producers that grow a lot less fruit, but there's a lot more of them. That's been pretty common since the 1990s. Prior to that, we really were a wholesale apple industry. You put apples on the truck and you shipped it to a packing house and you got a check somewhere, but there was no customer interaction. And we still have some of that, and we still have some growers that are supplying some pretty big accounts up and down the eastern seaboard. We even have a few fruit that are going internationally. So, and that's a large, when we talk about the amount of fruit that are grown, 80% or so of the fruit are grown by 6 or 8 growers in the state. And they're a major part of the agricultural industry. When you think of the big agricultural industries in Vermont, it goes milk, maple, and then apples. And it still is like that. However, within that, we are no longer 85% wholesale markets. We're probably now in the 55–60% range. And there's certain lines that are blurring. So a decent sized orchard, 100, 200 acres, somewhere in there. Nowadays we have a number of them that are still selling their fruit wholesale, but instead of shipping the fruit on a truck to a packing house that might be out of state, they own the packing house, they own the truck, they make the calls, they do the delivery, and when you buy that fruit in the stores, and it's very easy to find these from specific orchards, it's branded all the way through. And so the message, even though the grower isn't making the direct sale and handing the bag of fruit to the customer has that connection to the grower. And we have a number of our larger growers are tapping into that model. So we call that the direct store delivery model. And that's been a big change. It's allowed growers to be a little bit more price makers than price takers. They still have to compete in the greater grocery store model and the global industry, but they're able to control their costs a little bit more. They're a little bit more able to dictate prices a little bit. The other change is, of course, we've got a lot more shift toward retail orchards, whether it be farm stand, pick your own, and that's been going on for 20 years or so. And with that has really come a proliferation of new varieties that, even 20 years ago, McIntosh was 85% of the crop. Now it's about 65, and it's always going to be the dominant apple. Vermont, it's the state apple. There's a reason why McIntosh flourished here, and it's because the climate is best for growing McIntosh. That said, there are a lot more new varieties. Honeycrisp, of course, is a standard now. I mean, it was only 10 years ago that it was a new kid on the block, and every orchard has them. And either in between those, you've got Fujis and Galas, but you've also got a lot more antique varieties that are going in. There was a recent story that came out in the press about one market in town that has 25 different apple varieties. This is a grocery store. That are all on display at the same time, coming from 4 or 5 different orchards. They really took pride in showing off Vermont's diversity of fruit. And so we're seeing that, a lot more diversity of fruit. And then, of course, there is the cider market, which is an interesting one because largely the cider market is still living off of the market of cold or second grade dessert fruit, because that's what the volume is always going to be until there's some real changes in terms of what people are planting, replanting these new varieties. So the amount of demand that has come, particularly from a couple of very local regional cideries, local and regional cideries, has literally doubled the price of a cider apple in the last 5 years or so. And that's been good. Not enough for growers to just start growing cider apples, but it really has changed their bottom line so that if they can produce 80% US #1 fancy fruit and 20%, and that 20% they can sell for twice the price they used to, it's making a big difference. We're also seeing, I think it's raising more awareness amongst particularly millennials that apples are a crop in Vermont. We have shrunk in acreage from about 4,000 to about 2,000 acres over the last 30, 40 years. That hasn't happened quickly, but it has slowly been happening. We're still producing as much fruit, so it's very similar to the maple industry and the milk industry, that we're getting more efficient and honing down acreage. So people might not see orchards, as they might not drive by orchards as often. They might not see them as regularly, and so I think that the cider movement has helped to kind of keep that in people's minds.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to Terry Bradshaw at the UVM Hort Farm. For more information about the farm, including the self-guided tour, check the website on your screen, uvm.edu/Hortfarm. That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.